I hope everyone can hear us. I'm Jeff Cross. I'm here with Victor Sapkin and Rob Wormald, and this is our first public version of Connect Live. We've got lots of people joining us, many of our clients, over 700 people have registered, and I see lots of people have already dialed in, so that's great. We're really excited to talk about something Rob was very excited about. I hope, or this will be a boring webinar meeting, but yeah, we're going to talk about Angular Ivy. So just a quick introduction, a little bit of business before we get started. As you may know, or hopefully you've seen as registering for this, Nrwl is an Angular company. We do everything with Angular. We're very interested in Angular. We helped contribute to what Angular is today. We've got some open source projects that a lot of folks are already using, NX and Angular Console. NX is what we've built to help enterprise teams or large teams building big applications or applications of any size be more effective. And Angular Console is our newest endeavor, which is our UI for the Angular CLI that we're working with the Angular team on. Something new we've been offering, which is a new iteration on something we've been doing for the past couple of years for our clients, is called Nrwl Connect. And what this is a way of us providing support through Angular Console and other channels where people can get help and get guidance from us and straight from Nrwl, like how we think apps should be built, some things that you may run into, some best practices, basically helping architects and contributors be more effective building Angular applications, not getting stuck. And right now, it's delivered through Angular Console. We have the ability for people to get help through other channels and through our own portal. And we provide advanced Angular guidance and resources straight from the Nrwl. This panel is one of the things we do on a monthly basis for our clients, where we talk about different topics, do some questions that we can answer, some live questions, some prepared questions, and basically keep everyone up to date on what's happening in Angular. And right now, it's in private beta with our existing support customers, but this is one event that we're doing for the public, and Rob Wormald's been nice enough to join us for this. So without further ado, let's talk about what we came here to talk about, which is Angular Ivy. And I'll shut off my camera if I can find my screen, if I can find my mouse, so you can just see our pretty faces. All right. Welcome. So in case you couldn't see us before, I'm Jeff.
I'm Victor, yeah. And I'm Rob.
And we're going to talk about the new, so Ivy's not just a renderer, it's like part compiler, part renderer. What do we call it?
Yeah, so it's actually an engineer clarified this for me the other day because I got it wrong. So the kind of two terms that we talk about here, Ivy is sort of the replacement for how Angular works, if you like. So historically, we've called that the view engine. That's kind of what the current version is known as. And it's effectively like, it is really how Angular works. It is how, change detection runs, just kind of the algorithm that makes Angular work. And part of that effort for Ivy is also improving the renderer. And in fact, what we've done is when we talk about renderer 3, which is you may see that around in our kind of GitHub issues, that is effectively there is no renderer 3. And that's just an effort towards simplifying Angular to, shipping less code, to generally just trying to simplify the whole thing. So in general, Ivy is a sort of refactoring of the internals of Angular. The intention is that obviously we want to make sure that it is backwards compatible. So our primary goal with Ivy at first is to make sure that we can improve the internals without you worrying about your code at all, without having to change anything. Obviously, we want to keep that stable. But it does open up some very interesting options for the future of Angular. And I think in general, we think that most people will build large applications the way that they're currently building applications. But Ivy and this kind of way of thinking about Angular allows us to begin to think about different use cases for Angular. So things like building reusable web components, right? And having them to be small enough that we're not kind of worried about the size. Also some more dynamic things, like it's a lot more flexible. A lot of the stuff we get requests from users are doing sort of dynamic things. They want to dynamically assemble a form or whatever.
So to take a step back, so you're, because a lot of people submitted questions to this effect beforehand. So you can build apps differently in an Ivy world than you can build them now, but you can also build apps the same way you have been building them.
Yeah, very much so. So Ivy is sort of like, it's a rewrite of the internals of Angular kind of inside of Angular, if you like. And so absolutely the apps that you're building today, that style of with ng modules and assembling and labeling and all that, I think that that works pretty well for enterprises. And so we will obviously absolutely continue that, right? That's not something that we want to change the way of thinking about. But I think one of the things that we've kind of learned and internalized over the past 3 years of working on Angular 2, if you prefer. I'm just there's nobody here supervising me, so I can call it Angular 2 if I want to. Has been that like the way that you build a big enterprise application is not necessarily the best way to build something else. So things like fast websites or your blog, you want to be able to adapt Angular for the specific use case, right?
Yeah, even for large enterprises, like all the large companies have things like, content management systems, when they want to wire things up together, right? Well, they want to use custom elements, which are easier to implement design.
Or dashboards.
Or dashboards. And the dynamic sort of, we call it the dynamic dynamic database-driven dashboard design. This is a common use case we hear from all kinds of developers, right? And that's really like, you don't want to use a template as much as you want to compose a bunch of things at runtime. And Ivy, one of the design principles of Ivy is to make that kind of thing much, much simpler to do.
So maybe you can tell, if you step back a little bit, how Ivy came to be, because was someone like,
why did it take you 4 tries to get it?
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So
what's 5 going to look
what's
like?
5 going to look like? What's the 5th render?
V, I guess.
V, render V for the inside of Angular X, we should call it that. So where did it come from? So one of the goals with Angular, I think in general, and you guys were both on the team when we kind of designed this, was that AngularJS sort of went stale, right? In the sense that we built this thing and it didn't really evolve as the web platform evolved. And we got into this point where, we weren't using ES modules, we weren't using promises, we weren't using what the web, was providing for us. And so I think one of the design principles of Angular in general was to make sure that we could evolve with the web platform as things improved, and not just as the web platform improved, but as our customers changed, as we had different use cases come in, we wanted to be flexible enough to adapt Angular so it never got stale. And Ivy is actually the 3rd time we've done this kind of rewrite. It's probably more like the 6th time for real, but it's kind of the 3rd public iteration of this renderer. And the way that Angular is designed is such that we have this compiler and we have you write templates. And templates are interesting because they don't have any implementation details, right? You can take a template, leave that alone, and translate that to any number of different ways of doing things. And so we've done this twice, and the first time we did it, it was extremely fast. But one of the things that we found was that at the expense of being extremely fast, we were very, very large in the sense that every single template generated more code than it should. So it's very fast, but probably too large to scale properly. And so the second iteration, we kind of tweaked that formula a little bit, and we adapted the system so it was much smaller when we generated code and just about as fast. I think it was sort of within 1 or 2%. And that was really based on feedback from our developers saying, look, this is too big, or this isn't fitting my use cases. And so we kind of had this similar discussion where people started to use Angular for websites and blogs and more flexible things. And there was a pushback from people that said, look, we really like using Angular, but some of these things are more complicated than they should be. And at the same time, a lot of these applications were too large for these smaller use cases, right? So again, if you're building a large enterprise application, a couple 100 kilobytes here or there is not a major thing. It's something you should be aware of, right? But it's a different kind of math than if you were building a blog or your static content site, right? And so from a lot of our developers, we heard really that Angular was either too big or kind of too static and too limited for people. And so Ivy was a rethink of this and say, okay, can we, again, allow you to use the same Angular, but can we make it more flexible in some of these cases? And so actually a couple of our open source contributors, Pavel and Bertrand, who are big Angular contributors, they came to us, I guess, last summer, and they've been kind of working on this idea for a little while, and it really kind of resonated with us. And so we sort of brought them on board to really implement that thing. So Ivy is this kind of, at the core, is a very simple algorithm, if you like. And we looked at it and said, this is the kind of thing we want from the flexibility of our users. And could we, again, make this change where we left Angular alone, but change the internals, and then you get those benefits? So it's really a response to sort of customer input saying, we need it to be smaller, we need to be faster, we need to be more flexible.
So here you are months in. I'm really excited looking at like the example apps you have in the repo and looking at the sizes and things like that. Like what kind of benchmarks or performance bundle sizes and things like that have you been measuring with the latest iteration?
So one of the neat things is that Ivy was designed, again, from scratch to be very tree shakeable. And the idea of this is being that you should only pay for the code that you actually use inside of your application. So if you're not using, for example, internationalization,
when you say pay for, you mean like Venmo money?
You have to actually send me a receipt at the end of the day. What do you mean by pay for is, right, you shouldn't have to ship those bytes. You shouldn't have to pay the cost of shipping that extra code to your users.
Right.
And that is a real cost for your users in many cases, because that costs them mobile data, right? So if you're not using internationalization, that really shouldn't end up in your bundle.
Yep.
And so that was one of the things that we kind of factored into the Ivy design. And so I think the benchmark that everybody likes to hear is kind of what's the smallest Hello World app?
Yeah.
And I think right now that's still tracking at like 3.1, 3.2 kilobytes.
Right.
And that's minified, uncompressed.
That is minified, uncompressed, and that is something like.
And that's just the JavaScript bundle.
That's just a JavaScript bundle, and I think that's something like 8 times smaller than the smallest Angular app you can do today.
Nice.
Right. Yeah, that's really cool.
One thing we should say is that I think that we realize that literally nobody is going to have an application that's 3.2 kilobytes, right? Because it's not an application that's very useful to people. But kind of the point of that demo is that we want to always be sure that we are validating that pay-as-you-go approach, right?
Yeah.
So but what's even more interesting is the to-do app is like, yes, it's still simplified, but at least it does something.
And so I think your to-do MVC, I think, is guess around 12 or 13K right now. I haven't looked at it in a couple of weeks.
I don't remember what it is from the. What's built from the repository right now, I think is like 16K for the bundle, right. But that's compressed. I don't remember what it was uncompressed.
That sounds about right. And so that kind of exercises that's the classic to-do MVC app, and that kind of exercises most of the features you use in typical Angular application.
Right.
And so we think that's a pretty reasonable baseline, and it'll be interesting to see sort of, we know we have this very small number, right? And one of the things that we haven't yet kind of decided, and this will not be something likely that we do in the short term, but something we think about over the longer term is, okay, if we can get you this 20K of Angular, let's say, how does that change how you use it? How does that change how you think about where you should use it? And so we want to obviously make sure that the kind of NPM style of importing and tree shaking works for you, but it would be really nice, and one of the things that I'm working on at the moment is to be able to just use Angular in a script tag like we used to do back in the day, right?
No, definitely,
and that would simplify things. And so we are very much focused on, let's make sure that we're only paying for the cost of what you're using, and hopefully retweaking the way that we package Angular a little bit to make that simpler to think about, maybe to make that less maintenance on your end, right? To have to think about how many packages we're dealing with. So Ivy, I guess one of the things we should be clear about is that Ivy, when we release the first stable version of it, you as an end developer will likely see not a huge amount of impact to your day-to-day life, right? Your code should not change, things should work the same. What it does do, though, is lay the foundation for us to begin to build new interesting things, think about different ways of doing things. So we want to be clear that, like, Ivy's not going to solve all your problems tomorrow, right? As much as we'd like it to. But the day after tomorrow, maybe, right? It does.
By Christmas?
By Christmas, hopefully.
And you can always, there are a lot of people who are quite, adventurous, right?
And that's definitely, it's those people.
So when I look at it, it's not officially supported, but you can, if you spend an hour looking at it, you can figure it out, right? And do whatever you want with it.
I'm convinced that AngularJS was successful because those adventurous people were always able to do what they needed to do. And that's how I got in the Angular team, because I was doing adventurous things.
I agree. We can talk about it in a bit about dev ergonomics and some simplified tooling stuff. I want to talk a little bit about, so you mentioned that it is more tree shakeable in the sense that it's probably the most tree shakeable thing you can find in mainstream JS space, right?
Sure.
And I want to talk about incremental DOM, or whatever the Ivy incremental DOM-like approach, right? Comparing to a virtual DOM approach, in a sense that one is more tree shakeable. Incremental DOM is more tree shakeable, right? And I want to talk about why is that, because it's actually it forces you to rethink how rendering works, right? But you don't have the framework interpreting your view, right? You are saying that I am the view, right? The component is the view, right? There is nothing else that looks at your component and decides how it should be rendered. The component renders itself, right? Which is a very interesting idea. Kind of reverse of what we usually think about typical frameworks, right? Where people try to minimize the interpreter.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting shift, the way that we've thought about this. And I think that sort of the view is this idea that has not really been a thing that we've ever surfaced before. Angular's also had this concept of a view. And I think now, being able to really think about a component as a thing.
Yeah, but by itself, without the framework interpreting the component, which is a great thing, right? So, and even when I look at the new APIs, when we talk about maybe in a few seconds, when you can render individual component, right? Yeah, there is a little bit of machinery involved, but like the machinery is very slim, right? Comparing to say, like rendering the DOM, diffing the DOM, and applying changes to the actual DOM, right? The machinery basically, let's hook up a few objects and then just let the component itself do all the work, right?
And that's certainly for me, I think, probably like you, I look at that and it fits in my brain a lot better.
Yeah.
There's a lot less kind of magic invisible stuff that you have to understand, right? And ng modules were very powerful, but ng modules have, I believe, a level of, you can't really look at them necessarily and understand exactly what they're doing. And we all agree with that.
Yeah.
You can look at a component, and this is one of the great things about IVC. You can look at a component in isolation and really go, I know what this does. I understand the whole thing. And that I think is very powerful.
I like it as well. I also like that the instructions that the component generates in its template. So the way it works is you take the template, you have the compiled set of instructions that you can then step through and it will update for DOM or whatever, right? Each instruction is independent. In principle, you could introduce your own instructions if you want to, or remove instructions and evolve the way you evolve, say, like machine code to bytecode, right? And on a VM, right? So you can say that instruction is still there and it will be there for years. But for all newly compiled code, right, we're not going to use it, right? So it makes the evolution of the framework a lot simpler, rather than right now, okay, we change the way it's interpreted. Okay, nothing works. We need to be very careful, right, with not breaking files. And here you can just like duplicate instructions and keep them around forever, right, without affecting any new applications at all, right?
It's definitely, I think there's definitely a lot of learning from the history of trying to do this evolution baked into this next evolution.
The new way instructions are generated reminds me of what we were trying to do the first time around with the compiler.
Yeah, it does.
Early in the design was like, look at how debuggable, like we can step through and see actually what's happening in the DOM. And it kind of got away from that, but now getting more back to it.
And I think this is a thing that on the web just sort of happens. You sort of end up doing this pendulum thing where you kind of go, well, we're too strict, and then if AngularJS was too dynamic, kind of probably the first couple of versions of Angular were probably too strict.
And it generated a lot of business for us.
Totally, you're welcome for that.
Enable those dynamic use cases.
Send me my commission whenever you like. But I think we're sort of swinging that pendulum back to the middle, right?
Yeah.
And I hope it strikes a nice balance between the speed and power that you're used to, but also some of the flexibility that we've been missing.
Yeah, the flexibility is actually excellent. Like it's a lot easier to do dynamic stuff, right? Than with the current version of Angular. One thing before we go into the ergonomics, I want to talk about performance a bit more, which is like the memory usage, right? Because one of the things that the incremental DOM-like approach, when Google released it a few years ago, and I remember the private release or whatever, right, that was circulating around, the thing that they try to achieve is let's not force garbage collection, right, unless we have to, right? Because garbage collection is expensive. On most mobile devices, most of the junk you see, the skipped frames, are due to garbage collection trying to collect garbage, right?
For sure.
And the Ivy, or like incremental DOM and Ivy in particular, right? They don't force a lot of garbage or like a lot of allocations unless you actually change also DOM around, right?
Yeah.
When you interact with the app, almost nothing changes, no garbage is created, right? Which is different from what pretty much anyone else is doing, right?
Yeah. And I think that this is one of those things that is very hard to explain in a tweet, the difference between these two things. I think, and we talk about this a lot at a high level, and I think one of the things that's very interesting about a template-based system like Ivy, or a JSX system like React or Preact or whatever, is that, as you said, that we understand, because we can look at a template, we can very clearly look at it statically and understand, well, these parts of the template are static. They will never change. We know that there's always going to be a header and there's always going to be a footer. And the dynamic bit is somewhere in the middle, right? And in a system where, like a JSX-based system or a virtual DOM-based system, you are constantly redescribing that same UI every time, right? And you are describing that UI simply so it can be diffed and checked and thrown away, right? And I think that as somebody who I'm a fan of JSX for a lot of reasons. There is that sort of inherent design principle in JSX and virtual DOM that always has that principle where you're always creating stuff to be thrown away all the time.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that the cost you pay for being able to write your templates in JavaScript, essentially, right? So you have to do it because we cannot analyze your templates because basically it's an opaque function, right? I mean, there is some analysis that Facebook folks are trying to do, right? But it's very limited because, like in principle, it's an opaque function that is not analyzable, right?
And I think that is. This is the thing that I debate with myself really often, right? But I think that idea is core to the way that Angular works, and it is one of the biggest advantages that we have when we think about performance on templating. I would also, though, and this is one of the neater things about Ivy in the longer term, is that if you wanted to, and we have kind of sketched this idea around a little bit, there are no real ideas to do this yet, you could very much write something JSX-like or JSX on top of that, right? And basically take the Ivy instructions and do the dynamic stuff with them at runtime, right?
Yeah.
But we have this kind of lowest common denominator power that means that if you give us a template, we will absolutely be able to optimize the hell out of it, right?
Yeah.
In a way that even in the simplest JSX, statement, you could not do or JSX expression. So it's an interesting thing, and this is the really nice thing about having this compiler layer, is that as we learn different things, as we figure out these different patterns, we can implement them, test them, and again, it shouldn't affect you. Whereas that's a lot harder thing to do if people are able to write arbitrary, expressions, JSX, whatever.
Exactly.
It's a lot harder for us to improve that implementation under the hood. That way.
So we got a lot of questions about regarding performance. Is all of the benefit of Ivy the bootstrap performance or the load performance, or what kind of benefits do we see in terms of creating views, destroying views, running the application?
So my understanding is I think that from a performance point of view, like a runtime performance point of view, there is not a major jump in Ivy performance, right? It is, and at the end of the day,
it's more memory efficient, which
much more memory efficient
means fewer garbage collection.
There's a lot sort of under the hood improvements, right? And it's going to be more efficient, throwing less junk away. It will be. My assumption is right now, and again, I haven't looked at the benchmarks in a little while, so my assumption is it will be slightly faster in some scenarios, slightly slower in some scenarios.
Yeah, that's why I've seen that whatever that standard JS benchmark is, they've seen slight improvements on most DOM operations.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that we can look at our benchmarks, and also really, quite honestly, benchmarks of a lot of the other frameworks today, is that all of us are fairly rapidly increasing or rapidly approaching the baseline, in the sense that there is so little code now in Ivy between your code and the DOM itself, right? That we're going to hit I think an inflection point where it's not going to get a whole lot faster than it already is.
Yeah. All long hanging fruit is already picked, right? You're
exactly
already very fast, right?
And I think that one of the things that's interesting is that there's this point of fast, but there's also this point of smooth, right? And those are two very different numbers. Those are two very different things to measure, and the second one is a lot harder to measure. And again, this is the nice thing about Ivy, is that it doesn't solve a problem of jank, right? But again, it gives the adventurous people, it gives our team the space to experiment with things like schedulers. And so, for example, the Chrome team a couple months ago, they announced an effort where they're working on a scheduler for the platform, right? With this intention that it is something that a framework like Angular can consume and use that to be smooth and perform on any device. So that kind of model is something that we think is really interesting, and it's a really nice property that we have kind of in the design of Angular.
Yeah. I also want to add that even though your runtime performance may not increase drastically or whatever, right? Garbage collection can actually be very important on mobile device, because most of collections will be 10, 20 milliseconds. It can be really detrimental to the experience.
Frame, right? That's a drop frame right there.
But also because Ivy makes the compilation a lot simpler, we'll talk about it in a second. Hence, lazy loading is a lot easier to implement in a very a la carte way, rather than have to go through these 5 layers of machinery, right, to bundle it. You can in principle make your bundles a lot smaller. Even if the Ivy by itself or large app won't generate a much smaller bundle, because it's so much easier to chop different parts of your application, just move it, over there, right? The initial load can be quite a bit smaller. Right?
That I think is probably the larger win in Ivy. The thing that most developers, especially those building applications today who've been building with Angular for a couple of years, that's where they're going to see the biggest drastic improvements. The simplification of lazy loading, I think, is the thing I'm most excited about. The ability to just load a component and render that component, as opposed to loading a module factory, or loading a module and then loading a module factory. There's a lot of machinery, as you said, 5 levels of it today. That there's a lot of very good technical reasoning that it exists, right? And that's a whole other podcast, really. But I think that to me is almost more important than the sort of bundle size and the tree shakeability and the runtime performance, right? That's my opinion. Only because I hear from developers the pain of, and I have tried to build my own lazy loaders to do clever things, to build the dynamic.
It is a lot of effort. The amount of massaging you have to do to bundle it up, reach out in the right place, right, to get the right engine module factory.
There's a lot of places unfortunately, sometimes you almost have to trick Angular.
Exactly.
Right? And I think that that is, again, that's sort of an unfortunate side effect of performance and static analysis and these things.
Right.
And it's, again, it's very powerful, but I think that the flexibility is the thing that's really going to change.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about that, about the tooling and why is it so much simpler compared to what we have right now, where if you run GC, you need to be quite clever and have a relatively standard setup, right?
Can you speak more towards the microphone?
Sure.
You can look at Rob and then angle towards the microphone.
Okay, I will try to do that. Yeah. So right now it's quite challenging, right? Or if you use Webpack, you sort of have to build the whole thing together, and it's not super flexible. If you have an interesting like business use case to like deploy things independently or build things incrementally, whatnot, right? So why is Ivy simpler? How does it work, like roughly?
And why are you trying to put us out of business?
Right. Sorry about that. So the kind of primary.
Just
again,
kidding, by the way.
Sort of we think about these sort of principles as we're designing this thing, and one of these principles was this idea of locality.
Right.
And so a lot of the cool stuff that Angular does, things like template type checking and nice auto completion, all these things,
right.
We're effectively analyzing your code to be able to do that, right? And again, one of the sort of early design decisions and one of the early design side effects was that means really to understand your application as a whole.
Right.
We really need to be able to compile your whole application as a whole, and if not compile it as a whole, basically capture a lot of information and pass it around. So if you've ever deployed an Angular package to NPM, you've seen that metadata.json stuff.
Right.
All that stuff is kind of information necessary to wire all of these things together. Right? Is, again, a lot of very, very good technical reasoning behind it, a lot of good, there's a lot of reasons that this happened, but it's something that, again, we were able to sort of adapt and make more flexible in Ivy. And I think I had a point, and now I've totally run off of my point. So I'll just,
it kind of ties in with the question. Like a lot of people ask about publishing components. Like either you publish an open source library, or inside your company you're publishing a library of components. Right now, there's a lot you have to do to generate those files and make it AOT friendly. How is that going to change?
So the goal is that rather than you shipping sort of uncompiled code and metadata, this JSON thing out to NPM, which kind of is a lot of effort for you as a publisher, but also then, as a developer consuming that package, you end up doing a lot more work, or your build system does a lot more work because it kind of has to reconstruct the other person's code at the other end.
Yeah, the magical files, like entry summary files and whatnot, are generated in secret places.
All this stuff, right? Like I understand, well, I don't fully understand it. Nobody fully understands it at this point. And a lot of it is like that will just go away because we are going to basically change it in such a way that when you compile your Angular code, it will basically be able to be shipped to NPM as is post-Angular compilation, meaning that somebody who's consuming this code does not need to compile it themselves, meaning that, for example, you could take an Angular library, publish it to NPM, and then pull it off of the unpackaged CDN without having to recompile it. And use it. And so that's the principle of this locality. There's like a number of different parts to this, but the first thing is that we don't have to analyze your whole project in a single shot. We are able to take a single file and analyze it, and this is that principle of locality, meaning we should be able to compile a file locally without having to understand the whole world. Now, there is a gray area here because we're sort of in this middle state where the new Ivy runtime is actually kind of being generated by the old Angular compiler, in the sense that the Angular compiler is today still looking at your whole application, but spitting out Ivy instructions. The kind of modern Angular compiler, and this is the kind of future of where we're going, is able to do just a local analysis on just a single file. Again, the backstory here is that if you've ever built an Angular application, an ng module is sort of the thing that glues everything together, right? An ng module is how Angular understands this is what components, this is what directives, this is what pipes I can use in this template. So we use that ng module really to understand the links between your application and how this thing consumes this thing, consumes this thing. Again, that works pretty well, but it does require us to understand a lot more of the application. We have to do a lot of sort of transitive understanding of the application. Ivy changes that in such a way that we don't have to do that transitive kind of understanding anymore, which means we can be much faster. We can individually rebuild a file at one time, right? We don't have to rebuild a whole project. One of the more interesting things we'll have to look at in the future, though, is if we want to be fully local, right? ng modules are sort of the thing that are not local in this model. And so that's the thing that, again, we don't have any concrete plans on, but we are looking at, well, what does it look to build an Angular component without using an ng module, right? if you used Angular before IC5, a lot like that is aimed for that version. And this is the thing that, we've done a couple of prototypes of this. Minko built a prototype the other day, and we like it. We're not quite sure that it scales yet. We're not quite sure that it solves all of the problems of ng modules. So it's not something we're going to do tomorrow again. But we look at that and we go, this is probably a simpler to understand model. There is probably, now, I think that there is value in ng modules in the sense that as a consumer of an ng module, it's a very nice thing to have to think about, right? Like if I want to use bulk material, I can just bring it in. Right? But there is a trade-off there that, it does complicate tree shaking. It complicates a lot of different things. And so a lot of the work that we'll do once Ivy is done in a backwards compatible way, in the sense that we can guarantee that all of the code that we've written today runs with the new Ivy compiler stuff, that will be the point that we go back and look at, okay, what does it look like to really take this locality idea all the way? And for example, rather than bringing an ng module, which brings in a bunch of directives, you might just be able to bring a directive directly into your component annotation and say, look, this component uses this directive.
Which used to be the case.
Used to be the way in RC4. And that actually, I think, again, especially for people who are maybe new to Angular, people who are not deeply interested in Angular, it would dramatically simplify our tutorial, for example, right?
Yeah.
Letting people get started in an easier way, I think, would be a big win.
And now, if you like with the tree shakeable providers, the new way to declare DI, right, actually works quite smoothly. I want that service, right? I don't actually care about declaring Jeff is rotating me toward the mic. Declaring the special HTTP module something, right, and some other module where I really want just that one thing, right?
Exactly.
I think for most people, I mean, there are use cases where you actually want to have like a different platform configured on some level, somehow differently. It's totally fine, right?
And that's why I don't think ng module will ever go away, right? Like, I think there is a lot of value, especially again in like an organizational context. To me, they make a lot of sense as an organizational.
I agree. So like if you don't have them, you end up having like fake synthetic components where you want to load something that is not part of the DOM, has nothing to do with the UI, but just carries it one thing, right? In say the context, in some examples, right? And you have this fake component, right, which you use just to define like a subsection of the application, right? Which an ng module is a much better, like a more clear way to express.
And when we invented them, that was one of the things that they ended up solving like 5 problems in a go, and that's part of why they're confusing, is because they're solving like 5 problems at the same time. But one of the things that I always remember talking about was like it felt like it sort of tied the room together in the sense that to me there's a distinction between a component and an application. They are not the same thing. Components may be part of an application. And so that thing of an ng module, like if we called it an ng app, maybe it would have been a simpler concept, right? But that I think will stay around. That level of organization will stay around. But a lot of the lower level requirements that we had for ng modules ended up going away. And so that thing, like one of the most upvoted issues on the Angular issue list is, a component must be declared inside of an ng module. Which is, again, it's sensible. There's a lot of reasons for that. But like if you're writing tests and things like that, it's really irritating.
It's painful.
And you can work around it. There's tweaks, whatever.
Aaron Frost was tweeting the other day. Shout out to Frosty if he's dialed in.
So that kind of thing, like again, that's not something that we expect to ship when Ivy kind of the engine ships. But I think as soon as that engine ships as a stable thing, and we're happy that we're backwards compatible, then we begin to open up the doors to here's interesting ways to think about this. And what's cool is that because we've done all this work over the past 3 years about building schematics and ng upgrade and tools to do all the migration and these primitives to allow evolution, I think that when we're confident from a stability and safety point of view that it's ready for everybody who's already written Angular code, then we will spend a cycle, like a 6-month cycle on our team, really going on a bit of a spirit quest and figuring out how do we do these things differently? How do we think about these things? Go talk to some of our users.
I think that's a good segue into talking about rendering components individually. I think
the spirit quest?
Spirit quest has nothing to do with Ivy. I'm just talking about I'm going on one myself. Actually, it's Angular Elements. So we've got a lot of questions about it. Like I think Angular Elements and Ivy are probably the 2, maybe Bazel being the 3rd, like the top 3 things of the future of Angular people are excited about. Elements being a thing, like we're using it with our clients now for a lot of good use cases. So people are asking like, what does this change with Elements, or what kind of use cases does this enable, or improve the performance?
The first thing is that one of the big simplifications of Ivy is that today in an Angular app, right, you start up a platform, and the platform contains the renderer, and that platform then you bootstrap a module, and that module creates an injector and does a bunch of stuff. And then that, eventually bootstraps a component. And to do elements, we sort of take the first two steps of that, like getting a platform and getting a module and getting all that junk fired up.
Yeah.
And only when you have those things can you then create an Angular elements, right? Which again is doable. We knew in the short term with elements that it wasn't going to be the perfect API, but we knew that there are lots of very good use cases that we can solve today, right?
And so this is a problem. If you actually want to create a custom element that can be deployed anywhere and be through an application, it has all this baggage.
And this is that inverse of an app and a component are two different things. And historically with Angular, you've only ever been able to start up a component by starting an app, right? And that makes sense for a lot of cases, but for an element, for a standalone widget component, whatever, it does not make sense necessarily. And so the great thing about Ivy, because ng modules are optional and because a component does not have to belong to an ng module to be declared, you can write a component and with a single function, and this is what I'm working on at the moment over the kind of couple of weeks here, is with a single function and very little ceremony, be able to just say, turn this component into a custom element and be done. You don't have to boot up a platform. You don't have to boot up an injector. And that in general, number one, dramatically simplifies the mental model of it, right? Elements itself, the Angular Elements package is probably only 200, 300 lines of code. Like it's not a complicated thing, right? It's a very, very simple sort of wrapper. It's not a complex thing, but there's a lot of complexity in getting to the point that you're able to use that, right? And so with Elements, goal one, obviously, is to make sure that all of the code you've written today with Elements continues to work with Ivy, right? Goal two, though, very quickly, and this is what our kind of little Elements team is looking at, is let's think about the other end of the spectrum. How do we build a date picker in an isolated way, right? And that means, we should be able to bring those directives in. Should be a very simple thing to do. And again, because the Angular Elements package is like, maybe 1K, 2K at most, you can build an Angular element in 3.5K of script and ship it, and that's all you need. And that, to me, very much changes the math of how you think about using these things.
Right now, if you have a bunch of them, you sort of have to compile them together to make sure the shared part is shared.
And it's one of those cases like you kind of have to trick Angular because you don't want to have a conflict. You don't want to have double bootstrap, right? There's a lot of well, you can do it, and if you need it, then you can do it. And this is why you guys are really helpful, right? Because you are doing that work for us. But we would dramatically like to simplify it so you can actually focus on doing business problems and not kind of tricking Angular into what it needs to do, right?
I also like that even if you bootstrap an individual element or individual component without going through the whole platform, whatever stuff, that I think is useful in many situations, right? You can still pass an injector. So it's not all your elements on the page are orphans that cannot communicate with each other, have to talk by a window or whatever, right? You can still inject the store. You can do whatever you want to do, right? Because you can provide an injector that will carry the right context, right?
And more or less, I think the signature of that function, the create custom element function that comes from Elements, the signature of that should not change other than the injector will become optional, right? Because the whole point, the whole ceremony of ng modules is to really just get an injector which has all the stuff that it needs, right? And if you don't need that, then it's easy to just forego the injector, or as you said, be able to say just create this component specifically with an injector at this point.
And in that vein, so we talked about some of the impact on ng modules and how they might change. We also got good questions about zones and change detection in general, like how will does this enable a zone-free world more easily? And I think most of the applications I've seen, like the demo of the to-do app and everything, are zoneless and are using other ways to run change detection.
So one of the things that is sort of muddled if you don't kind of follow Angular too deeply is this kind of mix between what does zones do and what change detection do. And for most people, they are kind of the same thing. One of the things is that really Angular change detection and zones are two distinct things. And the first is change detection is what takes the model and syncs it with the view, quite simply, right? And the second is what causes that to happen. And that's the point of zones in most applications. Is the only reason that zones exist is to know when to tell Angular to detect changes, right? And again, that is great in scenarios where you own the whole page, you don't really want to think about it, right? You're not doing anything that's kind of weird. That's great, but we have learned again over 2.5 years of doing this that zones are don't always play nicely with others, don't always play nicely in other situations.
They add a lot to the stack traces.
They add a lot to the stack traces. They make debugging harder, right? And so Ivy is designed to not rely on zones, but interestingly, it doesn't make any special affordances for it. So Ivy by itself, that is if you just write a brand new kind of bare metal Ivy app today, it won't automatically trigger change detection, which is interesting, right? And that's kind of fundamentally not how Angular's worked for a long time. In Ivy inside an Angular app today, we are using zones to drive Ivy, but Ivy does not depend on it, right? So that's another one of these places where we have kind of done the underlying work to make zones an optional thing, right? Angular itself does not require it to start up, but I don't think, and I think anybody on the team would tell you that we haven't yet solved what the solution to that problem is, right?
Yeah.
Most people who are doing sort of NGRX push reactive observable style, if you're using the async pipe, this is something you should pretty much not worry about, because if you're using kind of a push mechanism already, you're sort of 90% of the way to not needing zones already, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is one of the things that we want to make sure that obviously everybody who's got zone dependent code today doesn't change, and that's our primary focus. But again, I think when Ivy comes out as a stable thing, and we're sure this is happy, and zones are working as they should be, then we will do an investigation cycle on what does it look like to use Angular without zones. And I guess what I mean is, what would our recommended solution be for that? Because as you said, adventurous people today could very much. One of the great things about Ivy is to be able to change detect a component. You don't have to get the change detector ref and inject the change direct, and then you just import a function that says detect changes, and you say detect changes this component, right?
Yeah.
And so if you wanted to build a decorator that did change detection, or if you wanted to build a base class which had like a set state method like React does that does change detection, all of those things are possible now.
Yeah.
Ivy enables them, but I don't think yet that we know what the right solution is going to be for everybody. And my hope is that when we say, okay, if you don't care about how this works, then you're good to go with Angular and Ivy, right? Like, it'll just keep working. And the adventurous people, my hope is that we all spend 6 months hacking on some things, and we go, oh, this is a cool idea. This is a cool idea. Like, I've been looking a lot at Vue. I've been looking a lot at React. I've been looking a lot at Svelte. I've been looking at our quote-unquote competition, right? Who are all solving a very similar problem to us.
Yep.
And so I think it opens up a door to do a very interesting think about what's going to make the most sense for people, what's going to be the simplest way to think about. Obviously, I'm an observable person, so I think that observables make a lot of sense for a lot of scenarios. They may not make sense for somebody who's new to Angular. They might not make sense if you're just building a date picker, right? And in a lot of cases, the answer will just be, we'll just call change detection, right? Just call detect changes for yourself.
Yeah.
And that is less magic, but more explicit. And I think that once somebody understands that all they're doing is calling this function, then making something magical out of that is a much more feasible idea.
Yeah.
Right now, it's very wrapped up in a bunch of
it becomes more similar to what pretty much everyone else is doing. Let me just position myself right.
I'm going to eclipse you.
Right. So where you would call render manually, right, and people don't mind it as much, right? So if you're willing to basically take that responsibility, right, you can get rid of zones altogether. And
I think if you're going to if one of your things you'd like to do is build a date picker with Angular elements, that would absolutely be my recommendation, right? If you build a new thing today, especially something that's going to be standalone and used in a context that you maybe don't know you're going to control, right? It's very hard to convince some other person to put zones on their page.
I agree. I agree. Everything that is very local and UI oriented, right? I don't think you should be relying on zones that much, right? I think it's the fact that you can just ship it as just Ivy element or as a web component, right, or Angular element. It just makes the mental model in my head a lot simpler.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and I like some because of how much more flexible it is right now, and the dimensional state is such an interesting problem to tackle, right? I was thinking what can I do, over the weekend, so I can write a cool blog post to upset Rolf because it's or whatever, right? Because I saw a tweet someone is trying to implement hooks with Ivy with a decal, that's you can do something like that.
Yep.
And there are so many things you can do, sort of 20 lines of code, right? Right? So it will kind of work, right? So
I have dozens of those little experiments on my laptop, right? That none of them are yet the right idea. None of them are yet the thing that the Angular team has recommended, right? But again, I think for me, as somebody who has been both kind of inside the and outside the Angular team as a developer, and you've kind of done the same thing now in the ops direction, right? Is that there's a lot that we need to do that is not necessarily about performance. It's about flexibility. We need to make sure that we make our users who are using it happy. But I think it's incredibly important to empower the adventurous folks. I agree. The best ideas in some of the best frameworks, and even in Angular, right? A lot of the best ideas came from the community doing something, hacking on something, slapping something together. And the first version of Angular Elements was that, right? It was just a big hack to prove a concept out, right? And that I think is a nice property for the 10%.
No, yeah, I agree.
And I think having gone through the evolution that Angular's gone through is a good thing in a lot of ways. Like the fact that we got used to having this kind of global application where we know what components should be available in my templates, and it's enabled so much with tooling and IDEs where we get errors in our templates to say that's not the right property, or I don't recognize this component, things like that. So now we've gotten used to that, and we're designing to say, okay, let's have a world where we can have this and have the locality and the ability to export individual components as well is a great thing for everybody.
And we should say that like a lot of the stuff that Ivy is enabling us to do is driven by, again, this relationship between Angular and the TypeScript team, right? Mm-hmm. So rather than the Angular compiler being this thing which is like not really part of the TypeScript compiler but leverages the type, effectively we had to rebuild all the TypeScript compiler infrastructure ourselves, right? Yeah. And the TypeScript team, I guess, seeing us struggle and suffer through this problem, right? They worked with us very closely to design effectively TypeScript's not yet private but internal plugin API, right? Yeah. And again, that I think is one of these places where that's something that we didn't have available 3 years ago, right? Right. The web has evolved, the tech has evolved even in these 3 years, right. And it's these little tweaks that let us then make these changes for our users. Yeah. And so that, I think that's a good process.
Yeah, so I want to talk about the tooling of the TypeScript compiler because I don't have NGC, right? Mm-hmm. And now in the I world, you have like NGTSC and NGIV, right? Maybe you can talk about why there are two. And
how much do people need to know about these things?
Yeah, exactly.
If they're using Angular CLI.
Like, if you're using Angular CLI, you don't, basically. None of this is a thing you have to worry about. This is typically reserved for people doing adventurous things, right? Yeah. And this is how we do it inside Google generally. There are a few compilers now. So the first one is the existing Angular compiler, the NGC that you've known it, right? That does this sort of global analysis, that generates view engine code.
And that's looking at your application plus the components you brought in through
all that metadata, all that stuff. Mm-hmm. There is the new Angular compiler is what we call, I don't know the name, but we call it NGTSC.
How is it different from TSC? Right. So this is
and this is the difference. Like it's NGC versus NGTSC, and the distinction there is that really the new compiler is using TypeScript with a plugin.
With a like transformer.
Right. We've got a transformer API, as opposed to like we are faking TypeScript.
So compiler. All the options of like basically, if I pointed to the TS config, like would it just respect all the like basically. Can I use it like a TypeScript compiler, right? Is it like C++ compiler? I'm actually quite curious because if it's just a TypeScript compiler with extra stuff, shouldn't it just can I just compile with non-Angular stuff at all, or just have a TypeScript file on the side? It has nothing to do with Angular. I can still compile it, right? It should just not emit extra stuff. Or
and this is interesting. So the mental model of the Ivy compiler, I probably should have mentioned this, right? Is that so Angular has from the beginning used these annotations, these decorators, right?
Yep.
And this is kind of the AOT JIT distinction, right? But the way that the Ivy compiler works, or the mental model you should think, is that basically all the Ivy compiler is doing, and really all the TypeScript is doing today, is looking for those Angular decorators and turning them into static properties. We're basically like transpiling those decorators into a property.
Yeah, it's a very mechanical process.
Very simple. And actually, interestingly, the Ivy compiler, the NGTC compiler, it doesn't really understand anything about that template, right? Yeah. It doesn't understand the semantics of it. It just does a mechanical transform.
Yeah, it doesn't know where components are going to be instantiated, but the rest is going to apply where.
It just does a very simple, fast syntactic transform, right? And then at runtime, kind of all that magic stuff happens, which is the shift, right?
Right.
But again, that will, I think, dramatically simplify things.
Right.
So there's NGC, which we had. There's NGTSC, which is the kind of modern-looking compiler.
Right.
That is more or less driven by the just straight TypeScript DS config.
Yeah.
There's some Angular options in there. One of the reasons that you don't necessarily need all of the machinery that we had before, right? So like with lazy loading, that's not something the TypeScript compiler understood at all.
Right.
And so we had to do this TypeScript thing, but also then like trick the Angular CLI Webpack stuff into doing this, right? Yeah. And we really did truly have to trick them. You probably remember that. I worked on it. Yeah. And, it was a very bad week.
Right.
Whereas now,
that's
like,
when we decided to leave Google.
That's right. So now like the NGTC compiler, basically, it just does this very simple, takes a decorator, turns it into a static property, just does a little bit of transformation on there, but doesn't mess with anything else, passes it along.
Right.
There's this third compiler, and this is the one that is a little bit more hazy as to how this is going to look in the outside world. But So we have all this code today, which is already shipped on NPM, right? Which has the view engine kind of. Now, interestingly, there is no generated code in the NPM stuff.
Yep.
Right. There's just the metadata and the TypeScript code without the Angular junk in it.
Right.
And so there's this other compiler, which is the the ngcc, the ng compatible fill-in.
Oh yeah.
ngcc is the
yeah.
And the ngcc compiler is something that is going to be a like a medium-term stopgap. And again, if using the CLI, you don't have to worry about this. But the idea of this compiler is that it basically is a glue between the two compilers.
Right.
So it is able to read and understand the old format, the old metadata format.
Right.
So that means like Angular material, which is shipped to NPM already without generated code, would ingest that and on your machine basically like compile the old information into the new code.
Yeah, as if the author of that library
exactly
republished the version with Ivy, right?
Right.
So we just don't want to bother those people and pretend that they did it. Right?
It means that you don't have to wait for anybody to change anything to be able to move forward with whatever you're doing. Now, this is probably a fairly hairy problem in the real world because of how NPM works, because of how Yarn does. And so there is some unknown here as to how we'll deploy this to the outside world.
Right.
My expectation is that it should not be a thing you have to worry about in the short term. And again, we will just bake whatever this is into the Angular CLI, so the tooling happens automatically. So nothing you have to worry about.
And when you say short term, that brings us to the big questions. When can we have Ivy?
So interestingly, you can have Ivy and all the shiny like hypothetical things we talked about today. That exists, right? That code is out on NPM today. In the if you install Angular at Next, the latest version of Angular, right? That's got this new compiler. It's got ngTSC. It's got this compatibility. It's got all the Ivy code in it. I will not commit to a date on this talk because I was told explicitly not to do that by everybody.
You don't have to give the exact
time. You don't have to follow the rules.
Just the day.
I'll tell you where we're at. So we have at Google, I don't know, several thousand test targets, several million lines of code using the system, right? And so at this point, we are more or less happy. My understanding is we are more or less happy with where the Ivy runtime is at from a performance point of view and from a feature completeness point of view.
So how's that working? Are you like going app by app and helping, like turning the flag on to use Ivy?
More or less. Right now, it's going in our own test suite is going through test by test. I think the last count there was something like 95% of our existing tests are passing, and importantly, that's like.
You mean tests of applications using Angular?
Well, the Angular tests, but also our integration tests on our own. So this is like we have our first level of our own test suite on the Angular code base, right? And so we have half a dozen apps in there, but we also have several thousand tests in there that use the old APIs. And so the mission right now, and you can kind of watch it happen on the GitHub repo, is that they are basically literally going through and making sure every single one of those tests, as written, right, runs with the new stuff, with the new Ivy stuff. That's my understanding is that's reasonably close. Now, there have been a couple of situations where they've run into something going, oh, actually, that didn't work how we expected it to work. And this is one of the interesting things about like taking apart your framework and reconstructing it, right? Is you go, oh, that didn't work how we thought it worked, right? And so there are these cases where we're sort of going, we're not quite sure how we click these two things together yet, so they're just being sort of marked as to be solved. The team is not stopping; they're continually moving.
Post-release,
I'll fix it next week. But the intention is that all of those tests should pass before we do anything interesting in the outside world. And then I think if it's not happening already, it's happening very quickly here, where beyond our own test suite, we begin to try and sync this code that's on GitHub into the Google repositories, which at that point we will then begin to trigger thousands of tests inside of Google against all of the real world applications using this. And so when we are confident that passes, right, effectively when we can merge the new code into Google, at that point then we are reasonably confident that it should work for everybody else, because people do some crazy things inside of Google, and if they work here, it'll probably work in most places. At that point then we would say we are pretty happy with where it is from a stability point of view. We would basically turn this on as this is a flag you'll just opt into in CLI. We're able to say like enable this, and if it works, great. If it doesn't, it explodes. No damage done, right? Submit a bug report, let us know that, flip the switch back on. My expectation is that I think for the next version of Angular, so for 8, you should be able to have this on as an opt-in. You should be able to turn this on if you want to. I just don't know yet if we will be able to make that the default for 8s. And I think in general, I think we would err on the side of caution here, right? Like we don't want to unnecessarily make everybody change their stuff.
But in Google fashion, you'll deprecate the existing renderer.
We'll do that. And so a lot of the work that Steve and I will do over the next couple of months, right, is figure out these deltas and come up with a set of recommendations for the interim, right? So one of those recommendations, for example, is, well, Angular or Ivy doesn't actually need a renderer, right? And historically, the advice from the Angular team has been, if you want to touch the DOM, inject the renderer and use the renderer to set a class or whatever, right? And that is valid advice, right? But it's sort of unnecessary in Ivy, and it's sort of unnecessary complexity.
Right? A lot of that was to support other platforms like web workers and pre-rendering, which now pre-rendering is just using the DOM.
Pre-rendering is using the DOM, and with web workers, I've been working with Chris Baxter here at Google, who has this project called Worker DOM, and it actually brings that same model where instead of having like a totally separate abstraction inside of Angular to do web worker rendering, we're just using a web worker virtual DOM. So again, we don't really have to change Angular to make it work in that model. So it means we get rid of all this extraneous stuff, which is nice. So we'll kind of get to that point once we're happy that it's passing tests. We will, and again, like you can flip this option on today on your own project if you want to. I wouldn't recommend it yet. It is actually a very interesting thing though to like spool up a new project, right?
And Angular CLI also has a flag.
I think it's enable ID
dash experimental dash IV, I think.
There's a flag. I'll tweet that out later today. I'll go look it up because I don't remember what it is. There's a flag that you can create a new Angular CLI project. And a really good thing to do, because obviously we haven't documented these APIs yet. I get asked a lot, well, how do I play with this stuff? But go look at our test code, the test suite. And inside of the Angular repo, if you just search for render 3, that's kind of what we call the new stuff.
Makes sense. IV, render 3.
It's the fourth render, but name, I don't know. So that code is all there. And actually, not only does that kind of show you how Angular Ivy works and how you can use it, but also there's some, because our developers or our engineers are lazy like all engineers, there's already some of this metaprogramming inside of our test suites, right? So there's, people have always wanted this code that's like, they want to have a function that returns a component, right? Which is not a thing you can do today. Half the Ivy tests are written this way, right? They're metaprogramming, they're higher order functions. There are these cool little things you can look and go, oh. And I've looked at test code and already gone, oh, I could steal that idea for elements, right? There are things that are just like, I can do that now, right? And it's only because you've been using Angular for so long that you go, well, I can't, it's natural that you should be able to do these things. And that's one of the cool things that I see coming out of the test suite. You're like, All
right, we're in the final minute of our broadcast here. So is it fair to say if people have more questions, they could tweet at any of us? And,
absolutely.
If you tweet at me, I'll redirect it to Rob, and I'll CC Rob, and he can answer it. But any final closing words you'd like to say?
I think we're really excited about this, as we know the community is. I would just like to say that our primary concern here is not new shiny, and is our existing customer base, this existing, huge enterprise customer base we have. We have a huge amount of respect for them, and we have a huge amount of realization of the fact that we'll never be able to pull another AngularJS to Angular transition again. So all of this crazy stuff we talk about,
nor does anyone want to.
Nor does anybody want to do that. Understand that that our primary focus here is that backwards compatibility, and that's why I'm being sort of reticent about giving you a date, because we will much rather have people be safe and stable and confident, right? And have to wait a couple of extra months to get the new shiny stuff, then we would kind of put out a new shiny thing and cause a bunch of friction in the community and lose confidence. So it's coming. We're super excited about it. We think it's going to open up a whole new world of Angular. But at the same time, we are not going to rush into this, because we realize that everybody on this call, right, has invested a huge amount of time and money into our project, and making sure that we have made a bunch of promises, and we want to make sure that we stick to those promises.
Cool. Well, Rob, we appreciate you coming to the office early today and
thanks for having me.
Doing this. This is a lot of fun.
I'm gonna go back to bed now. So.
All right, maybe I'll find a sleep pod somewhere to. All right, well, thank you everyone for dialing in, and tweet at any of us at Rob Wormald, and there's only one W in that. It's not Wormwald.
Wormao.
Or Victor Savkin, or at Jeff P. Cross, and we'll do our best to point in the right direction. All right, thanks. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Figure out how to end it.